Hello all and welcome, and I'm the Realist Philosopher, and in this video I'd like to talk about the subject of racism, and why in all actuality it does not exist. Now first off, let's start off by defining our term, shall we? What is racism? Well, it's defined as ascribing certain traits or attributes, characteristics, to a race as a whole, be they positive or negative. It's also defined as disliking or hating an entire racial group based upon those said traits. That's it. Usually only the hate part is talked about these days, but both descriptions fit the bill as far as racism goes and what it is. Of late, though, racism has been further and more conveniently defined to also exclude any group that doesn't have so-called institutional power, insofar as who racism can be directed at, meaning white people. The majority, essentially. So, that being said, you might then be led to ask the question, well, realist philosopher, why do you then say that racism doesn't exist? Huh? We see it all the time in our everyday lives, right? Let me explain. If someone robs me, it would be apropos to ask why, wouldn't it? You would think so. I may or may not get an answer, right? But I can ask. That's normal. And maybe I'll hate the person as well. And that's also allowed, and normal, and rational, and good, because some actions are worth hating and should be hated, so as to not normalize those actions and to send the message that it's not okay to do that type of thing. I hate that. Nothing wrong with that. Yet, if I do ask these same questions, right? If I ask these same questions, but ask them about whether or not one of the whys contributing to such and such a behavior has to do with race. Oh no, well suddenly I'm out of bounds, right? Suddenly I'm being racist. Yeah, we're allowed to look at such contributing factors as childhood, lifestyle, drug abuse, no drug abuse, their environment that they grew up in, employment status, poverty. All these things are allowed to be explored as possible causes, right? All are allowed to be considered as the possible why for some group, for some person, in regards to why they didn't act that way, right? But not race. Oh no, race cannot be the why. Race is never the why. We're all equal after all. We're all the same. And any differences in our behavior, well, they're all social or economic, right? They're never biological in nature. And that's what racism says. And that's what racism says, that there's no differences whatsoever between the races. Everything is attributed to society, environment, biology, no way. Hence, racism does not exist. It's a red herring. Let me explain. You see, differences between the races, they do exist on a fundamental biological level. We have differences in speed, strength, IQ. These things have been proven time and time again, and if you've done the research, you know this, but I'm not going to belabor the point because some of you have not done the research. The bottom line is that there's a reason why the majority of basketball players and football players are black, and it's not because they came from poor backgrounds, okay? We know that differences between the races exist, and that they can and do affect outcomes. So let's not stick our heads in the sand and ignore that fact, okay? And if we acknowledge that there are differences, that differences do exist, then it's not wrong or evil or racist to point these things out. Racism says no such differences exist, and all outcomes that are different have to do with an irrational like or hate, i.e. bigotry, on the part of another race, right? Namely white people. Since we know that's not the case, since we know that differences do exist, and because we acknowledge those differences do exist and do affect outcomes, then we can safely say that racism does not exist, okay? However, I suppose that you could then acknowledge that differences exist and that sometimes pointing out outcomes and ascribing them to such differences is not racist. But once you admit that races have differences that affect outcomes, something that racism says is never the case, essentially you're admitting that racism doesn't exist. What then is to blame when people act irrationally or hatefully when it comes to someone's race, if not racism? Why? Hate and irrationality, of course. Those things do exist. You see, hate of a person, hate of a group, whatever, it's just hate. And despite what some of you might want to believe, sometimes hate is good. Sometimes hate is good and deserved. Sometimes not. It depends on why you feel that hate, the context of the particular situation. Sometimes hate is irrational, and sometimes hate is rational. Sometimes it's deserved, sometimes it's not deserved. Not all hate is wrong, by the way. It's good to hate those who do hateful things and evil things, right? Murderers, serial killers, they deserve hate. And it's right to hate such people, don't you think? You see, the idea of racism, though, it goes a step further and says that hate focused on race is not simply hate. You see, it says that any consideration of race when it comes to negative outcomes, or positive ones for that matter, is wrong and evil and should never be done. It's absolutely, positively always wrong. But you see, the idea of racism claims that hate focused on race is not simply hate. It goes a step beyond hate and gives the idea of racism, hate of someone based upon their race, or hate of a race, or dislike of a race, or even looking into studying the idea of race affecting outcomes, its own special category. And says that any consideration of race when it comes to negative outcomes, or positive ones for that matter, is wrong. And it goes beyond even that. Yeah, it says that any exploration of the subject in any way, shape, or form is unreasonable. It's always wrong to look at these factors in terms of them affecting outcomes in any way, shape, or form. You see, when you look real close at this stuff, you'll see that racism is not just a word, it's an entire ideology, and a bad one at that, based on a false premise. As for hating or disliking someone for their race, or attributing good or bad qualities to them based solely on race, or judging races by general trends they express as a group, that's not racism. That's not racism. That's using discernment and judgment. Judgment and discernment that's sometimes good, sometimes bad. Sometimes rational, sometimes irrational. Sometimes right, sometimes wrong. Sometimes flawed, sometimes not flawed. We don't need a new category, okay, to define what we already understand and know. Now, racism, unlike reason, discernment, or judgment, it's always wrong. It's taboo. It's never okay to judge someone by their race, or to judge races based on the trends we see coming out of that race, or to even question if race plays a role in different outcomes. Oh no, we can't do that. But isn't that absolutism? Yes, I can never, not ever, never ever go down this particular line of inquiry. I can't look at differences between races, never. And I can never, ever talk about biology and how that might affect outcomes or people's actions or anything. Yes, it can all be chalked up to society, you see. It's all a social construction. Everything is social constructivism, right? Yes, and such things as irrational hate and bigotry, well, that's just something white people do. It's not something anybody else does. And that's racism. White people who, by the way, can never be victims of racism, as the definition has morphed to exclude them. Very interesting. Look, hate is a real thing. Dislike is a real thing. Judgment is real. Practicing discernment is real. Even discrimination is real. The question is this: are any of these things racist? Like pointing out that racial differences can and often do contribute to outcomes. Is that racist and therefore can never be discussed? Or are these valid questions which should be explored but aren't because they're labeled as quote-unquote racist? And by the way, of course, obviously they are questions that should be free to be explored. And hate is perfectly acceptable sometimes, and sometimes not. The same goes for judgment and the asking of questions to find answers. And the same goes for discrimination. Sometimes it's wise to be discriminating. Racism, on the other hand, is an excellent way to end a discussion before it even starts. Well, before it even starts in depth anyway, because once you mumble a few words that fit the NPC narrative that has been drilled into people's heads, it triggers a response of racism. But yeah, it's a good way of ending discussion. It's a good way of shutting down people and ideas you don't want to look at too closely or want others to look at for that matter, like immigration. Yeah, you don't want people to analyze why some hate the idea of immigration, be it legal or illegal. No problem. Just brand those with concerns about the subject as racist, and no one will ever look any closer at that person's words that you branded a racist. Same goes for any other issue that might in some way include a so-called marginalized or oppressed group, like women and the idea of sexism. The truth of the matter is that what leftists label as racist, meaning always wrong, always off limits, Well, that's simply things that will lead to the asking of questions, such as asking questions about the differences between the races. If you hate somebody, people want to know why. If you have a hatred in regards to something someone did, bring it up, discuss it. But if that gets labeled as racism, that discussion never comes up, right? And what are those differences that exist between the races, huh? And how might those differences be contributing to some of the problems certain races are having right now in terms of poverty and criminality? We're not allowed to look at that because no such differences exist between the races. We're all the same. We're all a blank canvas, and any differences between what's painted on those canvases is social. It's not biological, right? In conclusion, racism is just a way of taking those avenues of inquiry that are perfectly reasonable and acceptable and making them unacceptable, while at the same time spreading a false narrative based upon absolutism, which is in and of itself based on a false premise, as I mentioned earlier. And that premise being this: that different outcomes in life are because of unfair treatment, prejudices, too much privilege for one group and a lack of privilege for another. That is the false premise. As for why the left wants to exclude the ability to ask questions about these things and automatically label them as racism so as to shut you down, well, that's another subject for another video. Anyhow, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if so, please like, subscribe, and if so inclined, please donate to my Patreon. The first Patreon listed below is for my Per Creation podcast, which I make twice a week. And the second Patreon is my per month Patreon. You can donate to one, both, or neither. It's up to you, as is life. I am the Realist Philosopher, and I wish you a good day. Take care.